The dark truth about the mouth of Sauron. LOTR. There is a man standing at the Black Gate who has no name, not because it was taken from him, not because some dark ritual stripped it away in a moment of screaming surrender. Tolkien is precise about this, and his precision is the whole horror of it. The text says he had forgotten it. That is not the language of theft. That is not the language of torture. That is the language of something set down so long ago, in a place so far from where he now stands, that he simply stopped reaching for it. Forgot, the way you forget the face of someone you chose to stop thinking about. Here is what nobody tells you about the mouth of Sauron. He was not a monster born in darkness. He was not some twisted creature shaped by Morgoth's first corruptions, or dragged screaming into Sauron's service. He was a man of Númenórean blood, the same blood that runs in Aragorn's veins, the same inheritance, the same ancient promise of greatness and longevity, and the capacity for wisdom that the Númenóreans carried into Middle-earth like a torch. And somewhere, across centuries of willing service, he let all of it go. Not because he had to, because he chose to. This is not speculation pulled from nothing. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down into the dark. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The question that should follow you through everything this video builds toward is this: did the mouth of Sauron lose himself to centuries of slow erosion, the self ground down like stone under water until nothing remained? Or did he, at some specific moment, in some specific place, make a decision? Did he choose to let his name go? Did he decide, deliberately and with full knowledge of what he was doing, that becoming nothing was worth whatever Sauron had promised him? We are going to find out, or we are going to come as close as the lore allows. And by the end, the answer is going to feel far more disturbing than either possibility sounds right now. Let us begin with the blood. Tolkien tells us directly that the mouth of Sauron came of a line of men of Númenor. This is not a throwaway detail. In the legendarium, bloodline is metaphysical, not merely biological. The Númenóreans were not simply long-lived humans with above-average intelligence. They were the heirs of the Edain, the men who had fought alongside the Valar and the Elves in the War of Wrath, and were gifted in return with a lifespan 3 times that of ordinary men, a body that aged slowly and gracefully, a mind capable of depth and subtlety far beyond the common run of humanity, and a spiritual resilience that the Valar specifically cultivated. They were the closest thing to elvish man had ever achieved. Tolkien writes in the Akalabeth that the Númenóreans in their prime could perceive things hidden from lesser men, could read weather and the movement of the stars, and the subtle shifts of the world's living fabric, in ways that bordered on the prophetic. This matters, because it means the man who would become the mouth of Sauron was not starting from nothing. He was starting from near the top of what humanity could be. But here is where it gets strange. The Black Númenóreans did not simply appear in the Third Age as servants of Sauron. They were not a people who fell gradually into darkness, the way Gondor declined through political weakness and demographic pressure. The Silmarillion is specific about this, in the chapter called Akalabeth. Before the downfall of Númenor, Sauron had already established colonies in Middle-earth, administered by men who had given their loyalty to him fully and freely, not under conquest, not under duress, but out of what Tolkien explicitly frames as ideological devotion. These were men who looked at what Sauron offered, which was power and dark knowledge, and the prolonging of life through means the Valar had forbidden, and they said yes. They said yes before the island fell. They said yes while the rest of Númenor was still debating, still wavering, still capable of being saved. The Black Númenóreans made their choice early, clearly, and without ambiguity. And then the island fell, and they survived. Think about what that survival meant. Every Númenórean on the island, the faithful and the faithless alike, 300,000 people or more, drowned in a single cataclysm as the Valar reshaped the world and removed Númenor from it entirely. Elendil and his sons escaped to Middle-earth and built Gondor and Arnor. That is the story everyone knows. But the Black Númenóreans, who were already in Middle-earth, simply looked up from whatever they were doing in Sauron's service, watched the horizon for the wave, felt it never come for them, and continued. The downfall did not break their devotion. It may have deepened it. The world had just proved that the Valar were capable of catastrophic, world-reshaping violence, and here they still were, alive, serving the one enemy the Valar could not simply drown into silence. What would that do to a person's theology? Unfinished Tales gives us something crucial here. The section on the history of the Second and Third Ages makes clear that the Black Númenóreans maintained distinct communities in Middle-earth, particularly around Umbar, and that these communities preserved their cultural identity across generations, passing down not just their blood, but their allegiances, their dark learning, and their relationship to Mordor's power structures. This is a people who raised their children in Sauron's service, who taught their sons and daughters that the Valar were tyrants and Sauron was liberation, who kept the old Númenórean learning, the astronomy and the language and the political sophistication, and bent it entirely toward the purposes of Barad-dûr. Into this community, at some point in the Third Age, the man who would become the mouth of Sauron was born. Picture this: a child growing up in one of those coastal cities, Umbar perhaps, or some darker settlement further south, who has never known a world where Sauron was not the center of meaning. His family has served for generations. His education is the lore of Mordor. His theology is the theology of the enemy. He has the Númenórean body, the long life, the capacity for depth and perception. He has been taught what to do with all of it: serve, learn, rise. And the rising, he has been told since birth, has no limit except what you are willing to give. What does that child grow up wanting? Not freedom. He has never understood freedom as something Sauron denied him. In his world, Sauron is the source of all the things that make life worth living: power, knowledge, longevity, status, purpose. The question for him is never whether to serve, but how far up the service goes. And the answer he receives, watching the hierarchy of Barad-dûr from below, is that the summit is almost unimaginably high. The Nazgûl are at that summit, former kings, former lords, men of enormous power and will who surrendered everything and received in return a form of existence that ordinary death cannot touch. The mouth of Sauron would have known about the Nazgûl. He would have seen what they became, and somewhere in that knowledge, the shape of his ambition would have formed. But here is what nobody asks. Did he want to become a Nazgûl? Was that always the goal? Because the Nazgûl and the mouth of Sauron represent two very different trajectories for a man of Númenórean blood in Sauron's service. And the difference between them is illuminating in a way that the films completely erase. The 9 who became the Nazgûl were, as Tolkien establishes in both the main text and the appendices, great kings and sorcerers of the Second Age who received rings of power directly from Sauron. They did not simply devote themselves to service. They were given instruments of terrible potency that over time consumed their physical existence from within, drawing their will and identity into the ring and leaving behind a shadow that was simultaneously enslaved and more powerful than any ordinary man could become. The rings did this to them gradually, over centuries, Tolkien tells us, until they faded entirely into wraith state, existing on a plane where physical reality barely impinged. They gained enormously in some domains, the capacity for terror, for perception of the unseen world, for command over lesser wills, and lost everything else, including eventually anything resembling a self that chose anything at all. By the Third Age, the Nazgûl are entirely Sauron's creatures, utterly without independent will. Their surrender is total, but it was also, in the beginning, at least partially coerced. The rings were a trap. They were given under false pretenses. The men who took them did not fully understand what they were accepting. The mouth of Sauron received no ring. That is the crucial fact. He rose to Lieutenant of Barad-dûr, the highest position in Mordor's administrative hierarchy, short of Sauron himself, through what Tolkien describes only as long service and great sorcery. Not through a gift that secretly enslaved him. Through work, through decades and then centuries of deliberate, chosen dedication to Mordor's purposes. Through learning whatever dark arts Sauron saw fit to teach him. Through demonstrating, again and again across an unimaginable length of time, that he was useful, that he was loyal, that he could be trusted with progressively more terrible responsibilities. And the price he paid was not extracted from him by a ring. He paid it himself, piece by piece, year by year. This is where the name question becomes genuinely devastating. Tolkien writes about names throughout the legendarium with a consistency that is not accidental. Names are not labels in his cosmology. They are not administrative convenience. The elves, who understand reality most clearly in the legendarium, understand names as expressions of essential identity, which is why elven names are often prophetic, why they change to reflect the person's deepest experiences, why the name-giving ceremony is among the most sacred acts in elvish culture. Feanor's name means spirit of fire, and his entire catastrophic existence is an expression of that name's truth. Celebrimbor means hand of silver, and the rings he made with his hands shaped the fate of the world. The connection between name and being, in Tolkien, is not decorative. It is metaphysical architecture. Now think about what Sauron does with names. Sauron himself cycles through names strategically. Gorthar in the First Age, Anatar, Lord of Gifts, in the Second. He sheds and assumes names the way a commander changes uniforms to deceive an enemy, which tells us that he understands names as expressions of identity, but does not feel bound by that understanding, because he long since abandoned any stable identity of his own. His core self, if it can still be called that, is entirely organized around will to dominate, and every name he uses is simply a tool for exerting that will more efficiently in a given context. And the names he gives his servants follow the same logic. The Nazgûl are called Ulari in the Elvish tongue. Their individual names, Khamûl, the Witch King of Angmar, the others, are not names they gave themselves, but names given to them in the texts, often posthumously, often by their enemies. The Nazgûl themselves may not use names for each other. They may not need to. Individual identity is exactly what they have ceased to have. So what happened to the mouth of Sauron's name? Pay attention to this next part. Tolkien's phrasing in The Return of the King is, "His name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it." The "for" there is doing enormous work. It is a causal connector. His name is unremembered because he forgot it, not because no one cared to record it, not because it was lost in the destruction of some archive, but because the primary bearer of that name stopped using it, stopped thinking of himself by it, stopped needing it. A name you never reach for eventually ceases to exist as anything other than a sound, and at some point, even the sound goes. The question is whether this was a single event or a slow erosion. Here is what Tolkien's cosmological framework implies, working from the rules he established across the full legendarium. In the Silmarillion, when Morgoth corrupts the Maiar who will become Sauron and Balrogs, what changes first is not their power, but their will's orientation. They do not lose capacity, they lose allegiance. And the loss of allegiance, over long enough time, produces what Tolkien elsewhere describes as a kind of thinning of self, a process by which the immortal spirit that once encompassed wide ranges of experience and care gradually narrows to a single obsessive point. This is what happens to Sauron himself across the ages. He begins as a Maya of tremendous breadth. Tolkien's letters describe him as originally a lover of order and craft and the detailed administration of things, and across millennia of service to Morgoth and then self-directed evil he narrows, until by the Third Age he is essentially a single function, the desire to dominate, wearing the last vestiges of a personality around it like a coat. The same process, at a scale appropriate to a mortal man, is what appears to have happened to the mouth of Sauron. Picture this, not one moment, but a sequence. A young man in Umbar, brilliant and hungry, performing some small service for Mordor that requires him to be someone other than who he was born as. A spy, perhaps, or a negotiator sent to people who must not know his true allegiance. He uses a different name. He plays a different person. He is good at it. The self he was born as goes into a kind of storage while he performs, and the performance works. He is rewarded. He is noticed by those higher up in Mordor's hierarchy. He is given a more important role. He learns that the performed self is more useful than the born self, that the person he is when he is being something for Sauron's purposes is the person who advances, while the person he was before is simply weight. And one day, years or decades into this, he notices that the born self is harder to find when he reaches for it. Not gone, just less present, less vivid than the roles he plays in service. And he does not mourn this. He chooses it. Because this is the key insight the lore provides. And it changes everything about how you read the mouth of Sauron in that final scene before the Black Gate. In Tolkien's Letter 246, discussing the mechanics of Shadow's corrupting influence, he writes that permanent spiritual damage requires, at some level, the cooperation of the damaged person's will. Force alone, even the force of a ring of power, can enslave but cannot fully destroy what Tolkien calls the capacity for selfhood. What destroys it is sustained, active, chosen submission. The repeated daily choosing of surrender over resistance, until the capacity for resistance has been exercised so rarely that it atrophies and finally vanishes. The mouth of Sauron did not have a ring accelerating this process. What he had was time. And the terrifying implication of that is that his self-erasure was not a fall but a project. Something he worked on across centuries with the same diligence and craft that a great artisan applies to mastery of a difficult skill. He became masterful at having no self. That was the art he learned, and Sauron taught him. Because this is what the passage in Unfinished Tales about Sauron's methods makes clear, that his greatest weapon against great minds was never external pressure, but the seduction of purpose. He found men and women and elves who were hungry for something, for knowledge, for order, for power, for meaning, and he offered them a structure in which that hunger could be entirely satisfied as long as they were willing to keep narrowing the range of things they were willing to consider. A scholar who wants knowledge can have all the dark knowledge Barad-dûr holds, but only if he stops asking questions about whether the knowledge is good. A general who wants victory can have all the resources of Mordor, but only if he stops asking whether the cause is right. The price of each satisfaction is a reduction in the range of questions he is permitted to ask, and each reduction makes the next one less painful, until the scholar has forgotten what questions even feel like, and the general has forgotten what a cause independent of Sauron's will might even mean. The mouth of Sauron wanted something from Sauron. We do not know precisely what. Power, certainly. Long life, certainly. Because Tolkien establishes that he lived across ages of the world in a way that no ordinary man could have without some dark prolongation of life. Dark knowledge, certainly. But underneath all of these, there is probably something simpler and more human than any of them. He wanted to matter, and Sauron made him matter more than almost any man who ever lived. Lieutenant of Barad-dûr, the voice of Sauron's will in all dealings with the outside world. The only being in Mordor besides the Dark Lord himself, with the authority to negotiate on behalf of the kingdom. In a world where the most powerful elves, the greatest of the Istari, the kings of men, all trembled before the name of the enemy, the mouth of Sauron was the face of that trembling. He was the reason they trembled. He arrived at the Black Gate, and the greatest army the West had assembled in the Third Age went quiet, not because of what he was, but because of what he represented, and he knew it. You can hear it in the way Tolkien describes him. His voice was cruel and cold, and he looked upon them with contempt and mockery. That contempt is interesting. Think about it for a moment. Why contempt? What does a man who has no self feel contempt for? Contempt requires comparison, requires the ability to look at something and find it lacking relative to yourself. But the mouth of Sauron has methodically eliminated his self across centuries. What is left to feel contempt? And the answer, I think, is that the contempt is not his. It is performed, the way everything he does is performed, on Sauron's behalf, using the last instruments of expression that a human face and human voice provide. He is contemptuous of Aragorn and the host of the West because Sauron finds them contemptible, and the mouth of Sauron no longer has any independent evaluative framework. His contempt is borrowed, his cruelty is borrowed, even his satisfaction in that moment, holding up Frodo's mithril coat, watching them react, is borrowed from his master's anticipated pleasure. That is not a villain standing at the Black Gate. That is a puppet. A very old, very willing puppet, made of Númenórean material that was once capable of so much more, doing precisely what it was designed to do. And here is the thing that makes this genuinely disturbing beyond the confines of fantasy literature. The West barely notices. Tolkien describes the reaction of Aragorn and the host to the mouth of Sauron in language that is primarily strategic. Aragorn refuses the terms. Gandalf takes the tokens of Frodo and Sam. The mouth of Sauron departs. The chapter moves immediately into the desperate battle at the Black Gate. The man who was once capable of Númenórean greatness, who made a choice across centuries that consumed every part of himself, is dispatched in a paragraph. In the extended film, he is killed by Aragorn in what is cinematically satisfying but lore irrelevant. In the book, he simply rides back through the gate, and then the gate opens, and then there is war, and he is never mentioned again. No one in the text pauses to grieve what he was. No one in the text pauses to even ask what his name might have been, because they do not know, because he does not know. Think about that for a moment. A man of Númenórean blood, with a lifespan measured in centuries, who fought and served and learned and rose through the hierarchy of the most terrible kingdom in Middle-earth, and at the end of it all his name is not even recoverable, not hidden in some archive waiting to be found, simply gone. He was the one who knew it, and he let it go. The most intimate piece of identity a person carries, the word that corresponds to the self, the sound that means you specifically, and no one else, and he allowed it to dissolve over time until even he could not find it. How long does that take? How many mornings do you wake up and not reach for your name before it stops feeling like a loss? This is the central wound the lore is pressing on, and it connects outward to something that the legendarium is doing across its entire length in ways that most readings of Tolkien miss entirely. Sauron's project is not conquest, not in the deepest sense. Everyone understands that Sauron wants dominion over Middle-earth. The armies of Mordor, the machinery of the rings, the long strategies of the Third Age, all of this is visible and has been analyzed exhaustively. But underneath the conquest is something Tolkien understood about evil that he articulated most clearly in his letters, and in the Ainulindale, the creation myth that opens the Silmarillion. Evil, in Tolkien's cosmology, cannot create. It can only corrupt and consume. Morgoth could not make life from nothing. He could only twist life that already existed, which is why the orcs are bred from elves, and the trolls are crude mockeries of Ents, and every terrible thing in Middle-earth is a shadow of something beautiful that existed first. And Sauron, who learned everything he knows from Morgoth, operates by the same principle. He cannot make loyalty. He cannot make devotion. He cannot make the kind of structured, functioning society that Barad-dûr actually requires to operate. What he can do is find these things where they exist and convert them, turn the capacity for loyalty into servitude, turn the capacity for devotion into worship, turn the ordered intelligence that builds civilizations into the administrative machinery of a death state. The mouth of Sauron is the purest expression of this conversion that the legendarium gives us. He brought with him everything Númenor had cultivated over 3,000 years, the intelligence, the long life, the linguistic capacity, the political sophistication, the spiritual depth, and Sauron took all of it and used it for the purposes of Barad-dûr, and in the process, burned away everything that was not instrumentally useful. What remains at the Black Gate is a perfect tool, efficient, articulate, terrible, and utterly hollow. That is what Sauron always wanted, from everyone, from the Nazgûl, from the orcs, from the men of Harad and Rhûn who march in his armies, from the very earth of Mordor which he has shaped into an expression of his will. He wants a world where every capacity for greatness has been converted into an expression of his dominion. The mouth of Sauron is not an extreme case in Sauron's view. He is the goal. He is what success looks like from the inside of Barad-dûr. Picture this. Sauron, high in his tower, looking out over the plateau of Gorgoroth, watching the armies muster for the war that he believes he has already won, and somewhere in that contemplation, a flicker of something almost like satisfaction, not at the armies, not at the machinery of conquest, but at the thing he has made over centuries in the shape of a man. The lieutenant, the one who remembers nothing before Mordor, the one who has no private self left to resist, the one who, when Sauron gives an order, executes it with the full sophistication of a Númenórean mind, and not one atom of personal interpretation, the perfect instrument. The most completely realized example of what Sauron's method produces when it is given enough time and a sufficiently talented subject. The mouth of Sauron is Sauron's masterpiece, and he made himself. This is where the lore connects outward to Aragorn in a way that should make the entire Return of the King read differently. Tolkien is meticulous about parallel construction. He does not place things in proximity accidentally. The confrontation at the Black Gate is not simply a military moment. It is a symbolic one, and the symbolism organizes around the meeting of two men of Númenórean blood at the fulcrum point of the age's fate. Aragorn, the last full heir of Númenor's faithful remnant, descendant of Elendil, carrying the restored lineage that Gondor lost through the kin strife, and the line of kings that failed when Eärnur rode to the Morgul Vale and never returned. And opposite him, the mouth of Sauron, also of Númenórean blood, also heir to that same divine inheritance, who has been in Sauron's service since a time that overlaps with the same political catastrophes that shaped Aragorn's lineage. They are not simply opposites. They are the same man at different branch points of the same decision. Because here is what nobody says plainly. Aragorn was also tempted, not in the theatrical way of the ring's influence on Frodo, not in the visible dramatic manner of a temptation scene, but across the entire length of his life, which by the War of the Ring has stretched to nearly 90 years. Aragorn has been living with the knowledge of what he is and what he could claim, and has been choosing, repeatedly and without fanfare, not to claim it. He spent decades as a ranger, living rough in the wilderness, protecting a people who did not know his name or his lineage, who regarded him at best with rough respect and at worst with suspicion. He could at any point have ridden to Gondor, presented himself, claimed the throne. The argument that he needed to earn the right to that claim is partly strategic, as Gandalf acknowledges, but it is also genuinely a choice about what kind of king he intended to be. And during all those decades, he knew what the alternative looked like. He had seen the Nazgûl. He had seen what men of great power became when they chose the other path. He carried Narsil, the broken sword of his ancestors, not yet reforged, as a reminder of what had already been lost down that road. The mouth of Sauron is what Aragorn was never willing to become, and Aragorn is what the mouth of Sauron might have been if, at whatever moment the decisive choice was made, he had reached for his name instead of letting it go. This is the second time the central question deserves to be pressed, and now it carries the weight of everything we have built. Not just, did he forget his name or choose to lose it, but what was the moment, the specific crystalline instant where the path not taken became permanently unavailable? Because in Tolkien's world, choices have finality in proportion to what they are choices about. The choice to pick up the One Ring is potentially recoverable. Bilbo gives it up, Frodo struggles toward the crack of doom. Recovery is agonizing but thinkable. But the choice to surrender one's name, one's deepest identifier, the word that corresponds to the irreducible self, is the choice at the deepest possible level of identity. It is not like giving up a possession. It is like giving up the capacity to possess anything as yours, because the self that owned things no longer exists. Was there a ritual? In Mordor's hierarchy, there is precedent for formal acts of binding. The Nazgul's binding to the rings is the most famous example, but Tolkien's descriptions of Sauron's methods in Unfinished Tales suggest that his inner circle operated through something more than mere political loyalty. The phrase great sorcery that Tolkien uses to describe what the mouth of Sauron learned in Mordor is not defined, but within the legendarium's framework, sorcery of the kind practiced by Sauron and his servants involves the bending of the self's will toward external purposes, what Tolkien's letters describe as the characteristic activity of the shadow, which is to make the self an instrument rather than an agent. If the mouth of Sauron learned this sorcery well enough to be feared even by Gondor's wisest men, then the sorcery he practiced was almost certainly also the sorcery he submitted to. He was both the wielder and the subject of the same dark art. That is a particular kind of horror. The man who became expert enough in the techniques of self-erasure to teach them to others was first their most willing student. The dark knowledge Sauron gave him extended his life beyond normal human limits. Tolkien does not specify exactly how long the mouth of Sauron has been in Mordor's service when we meet him at the Black Gate, but he describes him as having entered the service of the Dark Tower when it first rose again, which places his entry into Mordor somewhere around the year 2000 of the Third Age, when Sauron returned to Dol Guldur. Or perhaps earlier still, if first rose again refers to an earlier manifestation. Either way, we are talking about a minimum of several centuries of service, possibly longer if his lineage's connection to Mordor predates his personal entry. A man of Númenórean blood might naturally live 300 or 400 years. Beyond that, life extension requires what Tolkien elsewhere describes as a corruption of the natural order, a holding open of the lifespan by unnatural means. The Nazgul were held in existence by their rings. What held the mouth of Sauron in existence? The only coherent answer within Tolkien's framework is that Sauron sustained him, that the same will that shaped Mordor's geography and animated the orcs and maintained the Nazgul in their half-existence also reached into the mouth of Sauron and kept him alive past the natural terminus. This would mean that the mouth of Sauron's very continued existence was dependent on Sauron's active interest in maintaining him. He was not merely a servant. He was, in the most literal sense, a creation. His continued being was not his own to maintain. Every year past his natural lifespan was a gift from Barad-dûr, contingent on remaining useful, contingent on remaining sufficiently surrendered that the maintenance was worthwhile. Try to sit with that for a moment. Every morning he woke up past his natural lifespan was a morning when Sauron had decided he was still worth keeping. And he knew this. He had to know this. A mind as sophisticated as his, given the dark knowledge of Mordor's inner workings, would have understood the mechanics of his own continued existence. He was alive because he was useful. The moment he ceased to be useful in the way Sauron required, the sustaining would simply stop, and he would age centuries in a matter of moments, the way the Nazgul would have if the One Ring were destroyed. Actually, hold on. Think about what that means for the ending. Tolkien tells us that when the One Ring was destroyed in the Crack of Doom, the Nazgul perished immediately, their existence unmade by the unmaking of the power that sustained them. They did not simply lose their power and become ordinary wraiths. They ceased to exist entirely. Their sustaining energy was gone. They were not things that could exist without the ring's maintenance. And when the maintenance ended, they ended. The mouth of Sauron's sustaining energy was also Sauron's will, channeled through whatever bargain or gift or dark technique had extended his natural life. When the ring was destroyed and Sauron's power was utterly broken, when the tower fell and Barad-dûr collapsed and every dark working that depended on the One Ring unraveled simultaneously, What happened to the mouth of Sauron? We do not know. Tolkien does not tell us. He is gone from the narrative before the ring is destroyed. In the book, he rides back through the Black Gate, and that is the last mention of him. By the time the battle is over, and the gates are broken, and Sauron is destroyed, there is no epilogue for the Lieutenant of Barad-dûr. But the cosmological logic is almost unavoidable. If Sauron was sustaining his life, and Sauron's sustaining power was bound to the One Ring, then the destruction of the ring would have ended the sustaining. And a man who had lived perhaps 500 years past his natural span, sustained by a dark power that had just been unmade, would have experienced something that makes even the Nazgul's end seem quick. They were shadows. They simply dissipated. What dissipates is not destroyed in the agonizing sense, because it was never fully present in the physical sense. The mouth of Sauron was physical. He was flesh and bone, and a mind that had been doing this for centuries. The restoration of his natural age would not be a fading into shadow. It would be an instantaneous reckoning with every year he had stolen from the natural order, every year of unearned life falling due at once. Tolkien does not write this scene. He may have chosen not to because it is almost unbearable to contemplate. Or he may have chosen not to because the mouth of Sauron, having surrendered his name so completely, is not the kind of character whose ending requires narrating. He was a function. When the function ended, there was nothing left that warranted description. He was not a person to be mourned or witnessed. He was a tool that broke when the machine broke. That is the precise kind of erasure he chose, and he got it. Picture this, if you can hold it without looking away. The moment the ring falls into the fire, and Sauron's power begins to unravel, somewhere, perhaps still inside the Black Gate, perhaps in some inner chamber of the fortification he commanded, the man who was the mouth of Sauron feels the sustaining energy withdraw. Not gradually, in an instant, like a rope cut, and he feels time fall on him, centuries of it, everything that was owed pressing forward all at once. And in that moment, fractional, the last flash of consciousness before the end, does anything return? Does the name come back? Does the person who let it go so long ago suddenly remember what it was? Remember who was there before the service, and the sorcery, and the long attrition of self? Or has the erasure been too complete, too thorough, too carefully accomplished across too many years for even the final unraveling to find anything to restore? We cannot know. The text gives us no answer. Tolkien closed that door completely. And maybe that is the most honest thing about the whole story. Some losses are permanent. Some choices carry you past the point of return so gradually that by the time you might have wanted to go back, you have already forgotten what you were going back to. There is a moment in the Akallabeth that almost no one connects to the mouth of Sauron, but it belongs to this conversation. Tolkien writes about the men of Númenor in their final corruption, the generation that sailed with Ar-Pharazôn to attack the Undying Lands in an act of hubristic insanity that prompted the Valar to reshape the world, and he describes how they knew, the wisest of them, that what they were doing was wrong. They knew that Sauron had led them to catastrophe, and they sailed anyway. Not because they had lost the capacity to know better, but because they had spent so many years choosing not to exercise that capacity that it had become, functionally, inoperative. They had knowledge of good, and they used it for nothing. The Black Númenóreans who survived did so because they were not on the island, but their spiritual condition was identical to those who drowned. The capacity for knowing better was present and unused, cultivated into uselessness by generations of choosing not to care about the distinction between good and darkness. The mouth of Sauron is the logical endpoint of this lineage, not the beginning of the corruption, the culmination, the perfected product of 3,000 years of deliberate moral atrophy. He did not fall suddenly. His entire lineage had been falling, generation by generation, and he simply fell the last distance. The final step is always the one that looks like the biggest, because it is the most visible, but the ground was prepared over centuries before his individual choice entered the picture. Does that make his choice less his own, less culpable, less tragic? No. This is crucial because Tolkien is not a determinist. Free will, the genuine capacity to choose otherwise, is one of the axioms of his entire cosmological system, the gift of Ilúvatar to men specifically, the thing that makes men more interesting and more frightening than elves in the theology of Arda, because elves are bound to the world and its fate in ways that men are not, and the freedom men have, to choose, to surprise, to exceed or fail their nature, is the genuine article. The mouth of Sauron could have chosen otherwise. At every point in the long erosion, at whatever moment the name was finally let go, he could have reached for it instead. He did not. And that is not Sauron's crime alone. It is his. Now here is where the lore connects to something that the films stripped away entirely, and in stripping it away they reduced one of Tolkien's most carefully constructed symbolic confrontations to a bit of theatrical menace resolved by a sword stroke. In the book, Aragorn does not kill the mouth of Sauron. Think about that. The extended cut of Peter Jackson's film has Aragorn draw Andúril and take the mouth of Sauron's head in a single clean stroke before negotiation even begins, which is cinematically visceral and completely at odds with what Tolkien actually wrote. In the book, the confrontation is a negotiation, a terrible one, conducted under conditions of maximal cruelty, with the mouth of Sauron displaying what appear to be Frodo's belongings and laying out terms for a surrender that amounts to Gondor's complete capitulation. Aragorn refuses the terms. Gandalf takes the items and rebukes the messenger directly, telling him his master has not correctly estimated the quality of the men he is facing. And then the mouth of Sauron departs, on his own terms, on his horse, back through the gate that opened for him. Aragorn does not strike him, does not pursue him, does not have him detained. The king who has just refused Sauron's terms lets the instrument of those terms ride away unmolested. Why? The answer is not purely strategic, though there is a strategic dimension. The answer is in who Aragorn is, and what he understands about the nature of the confrontation he has just survived. The mouth of Sauron came to break them, not with armies, not yet, but with hopelessness, with the apparent proof that Frodo and Sam had been captured, that the quest had failed, that there was nothing left but the terms Mordor was offering. He came to convert them, in the space of a negotiation, from a fighting force into a defeated one. That is the sorcery he practiced. Words and symbols wielded to hollow out will. Aragorn's refusal is not military. It is an act of identity. He looks at the mouth of Sauron, this thing that Sauron made from Númenórean material, this accomplished and terrible result of everything the enemy's method produces, and he says no, not just to the terms, to the entire implicit argument, to the suggestion that this is what power looks like from the inside, that this is what winning requires, that the only path to standing at the fulcrum of history is to become what this figure has become. He says no by remaining who he is. And there is something in that, a quiet something that Tolkien does not editorialize about, but which the structure of the scene insists on, that is, the real victory at the Black Gate. Not the military outcome, not the eventual destruction of the ring, which Aragorn could not have engineered. The victory is the refusal to be hollowed, the maintenance, under maximum pressure, of the self that the mouth of Sauron had spent centuries methodically eliminating. Aragorn looked at the mirror and did not become it. This connects, through the deepest architecture of the legendarium, to something Tolkien described in his letters about the nature of the hero in his world. He was deeply uncomfortable with the conventional heroic arc, where the protagonist wins through superior power or cunning, and his own work systematically subverts this. Frodo fails at the crack of doom, cannot claim the victory of will that the entire quest demanded, and the ring is destroyed by accident of fate and the lingering consequence of mercy shown to Gollum. Aragorn wins the military victory, but only after the essential work has been done elsewhere, by someone far less powerful than himself. Sam carries Frodo up the mountain when Frodo can no longer carry himself. The eucatastrophe, Tolkien's term for the sudden turn at the moment of greatest despair, is not earned by the hero's strength. It is arrived at through the accumulated weight of small right choices made under pressure across a very long time. The mouth of Sauron made the opposite accumulated weight. Small wrong choices made under conditions of comfort and reward across an even longer time. Both accumulations are real. Both produce their inevitable conclusion. The difference is only in direction. There is one more thread to follow before this arrives at its full weight, and it runs back further than the Third Age, back into the Second, back to the moment when the Black Númenóreans first made their essential choice and set the trajectory that produced, 3,000 years later, the nameless figure at the Black Gate. Tolkien describes in the Akallabeth the original seduction that pulled the Númenóreans towards Sauron, and it is remarkably recognizable. It was not, initially, an offer of power for its own sake. It was an offer of meaning. The Númenóreans in their final centuries had become consumed by what Tolkien calls the shadow of mortality, the awareness that even their long lives ended, that even their strength and wisdom and beauty faded and ceased, that the gift of Ilúvatar that made them unique among men also made them uniquely aware of loss. They looked at the elves, who were immortal and yet visited Middle-earth and returned to Valinor, who knew no permanent death, and they felt the comparison as a wound. Sauron offered to heal that wound. Not honestly, not without cost, but he offered something the Valar had specifically withheld, the possibility of circumventing death entirely, of holding on past the natural terminus, of extending the self beyond the limits Ilúvatar had set. The offer was a lie, as all Sauron's offers are lies, but it was a lie built on a true pain. And the Númenóreans who accepted it did so not out of pure greed, but out of genuine terror of the void they saw waiting for them at the end of their long lives. The Black Númenóreans accepted this offer in its most complete form. They were not content to have longer lives within the natural span. They wanted Sauron's dark method of life extension, his prolongation through accumulated power and dark knowledge and the suppression of the natural order's claim on them. They got it. And the cost was what the cost always is in Tolkien, the narrowing and eventual destruction of everything in the self that made the extended life worth wanting in the first place. By the time the mouth of Sauron has lived long enough to forget his name, he has lived so long that the man who feared death has been completely replaced by something that is no longer capable of fearing it or desiring life, because it no longer has the selfhood that those responses require. He solved the problem of mortality by eliminating the person who had the problem. That is Sauron's gift. That is what it actually looks like, not in the abstract but in the flesh, when you accept the bargain fully. The Númenóreans who drowned in the wave still had their names when they died. They still had, even in their corruption, enough self to scream and mourn and pray. The mouth of Sauron, who escaped that wave, who lived centuries past those drowned kings, arrived at the Black Gate, having achieved what they could only threaten to achieve. And what he achieved is a condition indistinguishable from the inside, from the death he spent his whole life avoiding. You cannot fear the end when there is no you left to face it. And now the third pass, the question in its full and final weight. Not, did he forget or choose to lose his name? Not just, what was the moment, the crystalline instant of decision? But this, was there anyone to mourn what was lost? Was there a moment, somewhere in those centuries of service, when the man who would become the mouth of Sauron stood in some dark room in the interior of Mordor and felt the last of himself receding, and knew, in that final coherent flash, exactly what was happening? And if so, what did he feel? Was it grief? Was it relief? Was it the cold satisfaction of a bargain fully consummated? Or was there nothing at all, just the absence of the feeling that had been there before, a silence where a self used to be, noticed by nothing because the thing that would have noticed it was already gone? Tolkien does not answer this. He cannot. He locked the door from the outside and left no key. But the fact that he built this character, this specific and deliberate figure, into the climactic approach to the Third Age's final battle, placed him face to face with Aragorn in a confrontation the films misread entirely, and described his condition in the exact words he chose, tells us something about what Tolkien thought was worth contemplating. He thought this was worth being afraid of, not the armies of Mordor, not even the Nazgul. This, a man of high gifts and real possibility, who chose, across such a long time that the choice became invisible, to become an instrument, who succeeded at becoming an instrument so completely that even the instrument does not remember what it was before. Because Sauron does not want to conquer the world in the conventional sense. He wants to convert it. He wants every person and creature and stone and river that has some quality of its own, some irreducible selfhood, to become instead a reflection and extension of his will. He wants what the mouth of Sauron gave him, from every person in Middle-earth, one voluntary surrender after another, one name forgotten after another. A world that is Sauron all the way down, with no remainders, no wild margins, no thing or person that refuses to be assimilated. The mouth of Sauron showed it was possible. That was his gift to his master. Not political service, not military strategy. The proof of concept. The demonstration that a being with genuine selfhood could, through sustained and willing submission, be converted into something with no selfhood at all. The most complete submission in the legendarium, more complete than the Nazgul who were trapped into it by rings, achieved entirely through the free exercise of the will that Iluvatar gave to men specifically so that they could be free. He used his freedom to destroy his freedom, and left behind a face that smiled at the pain of others, and spoke with a voice that was cruel and cold, and remembered nothing of what it was like to be the person who was afraid of dying, who wanted to matter, who reached for a life longer than the Valar permitted and received. At the end, exactly that. A life with no ending, because there was no one left to end. This is what the movies missed. This is what every reading of The Mouth of Sauron that focuses on his grotesque appearance, or his arrogant behavior, or his function as a plot device misses. He is not a villain. He is a warning. He is the answer to the question Tolkien's entire world is organized around asking, what happens to a person who has every gift, every inheritance, every potential for greatness, and chooses to offer all of it up to a power that will accept the offering and give nothing back that matters? What happens is the mouth of Sauron. That is what happens. And the West, standing at the Black Gate, looked at the warning and did not heed it as a warning, because they were too busy refusing the terms, which was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, but which also meant that the mouth of Sauron served his purpose even as he was being rejected. He made them doubt. For a moment, when he held up the mithril coat and the grey cloak and Sam's plain-made sword, he made them feel the weight of what might have been lost. That was enough for Sauron. The doubt itself was the weapon. The mouth of Sauron was not there to negotiate a real peace. He was there to wound the will of the West in the moment before the armies came through the gate. And he did wound it. Tolkien does not pretend otherwise. He wounded Gandalf, whose face goes white and old. He wounded everyone who stood there and thought for a moment that Frodo was dead. He was effective, even in defeat, right up to the moment he rode back through the gate and ceased to be relevant. That efficiency, that cold and terrible effectiveness, is the last legacy of the Númenórean inheritance he had spent centuries converting into Sauron's property. The intelligence and sophistication and linguistic precision of the greatest mortal bloodline in Middle-earth turned entirely toward the purpose of making good men despair in a crucial moment. He was Sauron's finest work, and he was made not through force but through an open door that a man walked through willingly, centuries ago, and closed behind himself as he went. We never learn what it cost him to close it. We only know, from the shape of what remained, that the cost was everything. If you have spent any time with the legendarium, you have probably been drawn toward the great figures, the elves with their terrible grief and their ancient beauty, the wizards with their hidden natures and their divine origins, the kings of men, with their flawed heroism and their long decline. These are the characters Tolkien builds monuments around. The mouth of Sauron is not a monument. He is a negative space. He is what is left when a monument is disassembled stone by stone over centuries and used to build a wall for someone else's kingdom. The stones are still there, the material is unchanged, but the thing they expressed when they were organized in their original shape is completely gone, and the person who disassembled them knew exactly what they were doing and chose it anyway. And this, I think, is the genuinely philosophical terror of him, not the grotesque face, or the cruel voice, or the arrogant contempt. This, the fact that the self is not a fixed thing. It is a practice. It requires maintenance. It requires the daily choosing of it, the reaching for the name, the insistence on being a person with a name rather than a function with a purpose. And across enough time, under the right conditions, with the right incentives, a person can simply stop doing that maintenance. Stop reaching. Let the name go. Let the self go. Let the centuries do their work, and end up at the Black Gate, looking out at the last army of the people you might have been, feeling nothing recognizable as grief or regret, because the part of you that would have felt those things dissolved so long ago that you cannot even remember it was ever there. Tolkien built a world where names are sacred, where the elves name with prophetic care, where the loss of a name under Morgoth corresponds to the loss of will, where even Sauron's shifting names tell us something true about his nature. He built a world where identity is not merely psychological but metaphysical, where who you are has consequences that ripple outward into the structure of reality. And then he placed, at the culminating confrontation of his entire narrative, a man with no name. Not a monster who never had one, a man who did. A man with the best blood, and the deepest inheritance, and the longest life. A man who let it go, and asked us, without once making it explicit, to think about what that means, to feel the weight of that choice, to understand that the greatest evil in Tolkien's world is not what Sauron did to the people he conquered. It is what people did to themselves in order to be on the winning side, or what they thought was the winning side, or what they were told was the winning side by something that had been lying to men since before the world was broken. The mouth of Sauron was never on the winning side. He was on the side that promised not to die, and he got that promise kept, long past when keeping it made any difference, all the way to the moment it could no longer be kept, at the end of the Third Age, when the One Ring fell, and the sustaining was withdrawn, and the centuries came to collect what was owed. Did he feel it in that final instant? Did the name come back, like water finding the shape of the vessel it once filled, just in time for the vessel to break? We will never know. Tolkien did not write that scene. And that silence, that particular unwritten silence, is the most honest thing about the story. Because some things, once let go, cannot be returned, not even at the end, not even when everything else is restored, and the king returns, and the age turns, and the world is remade into something that can grow again. Some voids do not fill, some names stay forgotten, even by the person who forgot them. If this is a version of the mouth of Sauron that you have never sat with before, I want to know what it changes for you. Does it make him more tragic, more frightening, or something else entirely? Because I have spent a long time in this corner of the legendarium, and I still cannot settle on one answer. The character works on me differently, depending on whether I read him as a victim of the choices his lineage made for him before he was born, or as the most willful and consequential act of self-destruction that Tolkien's world contains. Maybe the most disturbing possibility is that those are the same thing, that the choices made for us, the lineages and communities and theologies we are born into, and the choices we make ourselves, are not cleanly separable. That the line between inheritance and decision is exactly as blurry in Middle-earth as it is in our own world, and that Tolkien knew this and built the mouth of Sauron specifically at that blurry line, as a question without an answer, a mirror without a reflection. If you want more of this, more of the lore that hides in the spaces between what the films gave us and what the text actually says, stay here. There is so much more of the legendarium that reads completely differently once you follow it all the way down. Subscribe and come with me. We are nowhere near done.